Hey everyone, it's Bob Pulver. Welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Dan Stradtman, Chief Marketing Officer at Bloomfire, a knowledge management platform helping enterprises unlock the full value of their information assets. And that, of course, includes all the tacit and institutional knowledge of its workers. Dan brings decades of marketing and research leadership experience from organizations like Walmart, GE, and Berkshire Hathaway. Today, we unpack the strategic role of knowledge in driving real enterprise intelligence. We're going to dig into Bloomfire's recent report on this very topic, outlining how organizations should view and measure the value of knowledge as a true asset, the impact of AI in decision making, and why trust and human centricity matter more than ever in a data and AI driven world. Thank you, as always, for listening to Elevate Your AIQ. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. I am your host, Bob Pulver. With me today in the studio, I have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Dan Stradtman. How are you doing today, Dan?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. I appreciate you joining me. Really excited to dive into this conversation. And I just thought, Dan, you could kick things off with just a little bit about your background and some of your marketing leadership roles. I know you've been around to a lot of very big companies. And so I'm sure knowledge management has been a challenge at a lot of those. I can speak from experience myself. But yeah, just a little bit about your background and what you're doing at Bloomfire.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thanks again for having this chat with me. Yeah, Dan Stradtman, I am the CMO of Bloomfire, but kind of a windy road to get there, if one might call it that. So, been called many things. A lot of people called me a failed psychologist over the years, because I do have a master's degree in clinical psych, which I used only in an internship capacity back in Colorado in the late 90s, early 2000s. But yeah, I've had the good fortune to be able to work for and with some of the biggest brands in the world. So, kind of took that training and research and statistics and methodology, applied it into analytics roles early in my career, then ended up with a division of Kantar. At the time, it was not part of Kantar, but it was TNS Global, working on consumer goods research and marketing materials. So, companies like Procter and Gamble and Hershey and Heinz, and then was able to go over and work in the automotive space for a while. Got to do some really fun stuff with General Motors and Audi when they were kind of relaunching their brand at the end of the 20s, I guess. And then got headhunted to go down to Walmart corporate and joined a team that was getting a lot larger at the time. So they were investing a lot in marketing talent, research talent, and I joined there as a leader in insights and strategy. Great brand to work on, right? Massive brand, was really putting its stake in the ground of what it wanted to stand for. Did that about 3.5 years, 4 years, and then was lucky enough to come up and lead kind of marketing strategy and research for General Electric and their lighting division, which I think at the time, I'm not sure Jeff Immelt even knew they still own the lighting division, but he actually made a joke once at an executive retreat I was at, that if they never evolved, the room would be full of light bulb salesmen. And I tried to not take offense to that, but it was okay. So got to really see this massive fundamental change in an industry, right? So think about 2011, you're selling 1 billion little glass light bulbs a year. By 2017, it's all LED plastic, can be made in any run-of-the-mill factory overseas, and you had retailers exerting their private brand pressure. So I led insights, marketing strategy, retail category management, and really had to put forth a different way of selling a product that had been there 100 years. Then then had the opportunity to spin up a new role and area for Lubrizol, which is a chemical company owned by Berkshire Hathaway, in corporate strategic marketing and insights, and built that team over 5 years there, which is where I got to know Bloomfire. We can talk more about that in a minute. That lasted about 5 years. Left there, took a short stint at Amazon in a research role, and then joined Bloomfire about 2.5, 3 years ago to lead the marketing efforts. So it's been a fun journey. I could tell you that it was all planned, but I'd be lying to your face. I've had a lot of good fortune to work with very smart people and very big opportunities, and I do, thank my lucky stars every day for it.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I know what it's like to be on that long and windy road. I don't know what they say about best laid plans, but you never know. You never know where the journey's gonna take you. No, really, really interesting. And then just for people who aren't familiar with Bloomfire, maybe just a high level view
Yeah,
of what they do.
yeah, 100%. So Bloomfire's been around since 2012 and was really the first knowledge management platform, software as a service. So, in fact, at GE, I recognized like I needed that, and I ended up building something out of what at the time I think was a precursor to SharePoint that was like a folder structure with a little bit of an HTML face to it, and I mean it was ugly. Like let's be honest, it was bad, and but it was really really well received, and so over the years, Bloomfire has evolved. We certainly have a large AI component now, but really it's always been about how do you connect the right people, the right information and knowledge, the right processes together to get a better outcome than you would otherwise. And, we work with some of the 15, I think, of the Fortune 100 and 40 out of the Fortune 500. So we definitely are there to serve those enterprise customers. And I think what we're seeing now, we've coined this term called enterprise intelligence because we saw a convergence of knowledge management with business intelligence and with enterprise search and enterprise data overlaid with this whole AI wrapper that is changing fundamentally, I think, how knowledge and management is going to be approached at most companies. And so we view enterprise intelligence as our next horizon as a platform. And that means, we need to invest in things that are going to be able to bring those knowledge points together, make sense of it for an organization that's now probably plugging it into AI more than it ever has, because, it's as true today as it was back then. It's garbage in, garbage out for AI. We want to make sure that AI systems are always building off the right piece of data, the right set of data for those answers.
Yeah, fascinated by what you guys are doing. I mean, I saw a lot of this I have a lot of experience at Fortune 500 as well, mostly at IBM, but then at NBC Universal after GE relinquished control, which is a whole nother story.
Probably better off for it in many cases.
Probably, although I will say that kept me quite busy in terms of the portfolio modernization work and having to relinquish control of, IP addresses. I mean, really got into the technical weeds.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
And so that was a whole interesting, use case. But I guess thinking back to some of my mid-career days at IBM, and we were talking about, expertise discovery and knowledge capture, and where are we storing all of this information, whether it's structured or unstructured. Let's create, obviously IBM, we had the Lotus suite, so we weren't using SharePoint, but, there were all kinds of repositories, and some of that was, of course, in specific domains, right? You had CMSs for, marketing content. You had, a whole research arm where some of that market research sat with Institute for Business Value and then certain parts of IBM Research. And so where I came into that from a transformation perspective, as I looked across data, processes, and people, it seemed like some of this was just so logical. Like, how can people access information in the flow of the work that they're doing, and in the flow of the decision making sort of process? And it just seemed like, back in those days, it was like, yeah, we've got places to put this information. And I like the way your report sort of categorized the types of information that we're talking about and the types of knowledge we're talking about. So we'll get into that. But it was really about, okay, yeah, storage is cheaper now, and we can put this in the cloud and everyone can access it. They can, but do they? Right? And even when we say they can access it, do the right people have the right access, or is it sort of a walled, environment where you got to know it exists, and then you got to know who owns it, and then you got to go get access, and then, there's still a lot of sort of friction and context switching to even get into it. So I like the way that your your report around the value of enterprise intelligence really sort of brought that to light. That says, like, look, if you want to disseminate this knowledge in a logical fashion, it needs to help people in the flow of what they're doing. And I think, yeah, I'm definitely anxious to get in and hear how you guys approach that, and how AI fits into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, all really astute points, and again, as both of us are kind of veterans of those big monolithic companies. I mean, as well as I do how hard it is, for anyone to join one of these companies and feel like they have the information or the connections they need at that company to be successful, let alone when you come in at more senior levels, right? Like, I think that's always been one of the challenges that people have as they, work through their careers. If you're joining a new organization, do you know the culture? Do you know where for lack of a better term, the bodies are buried, right? And a lot of that lives in that one person who, has been there 25 years, or that repository that no one seems to have access to. And I think ultimately that's what Bloomfire seeks to help to break down those silos. And that's when we see it working well. It's folks who are willing to do a little bit of change management to say, look, we get this isn't working. We need to rethink the way we're approaching knowledge. And I also think that's what's really elevated now knowledge management and those kind of ancillary categories I brought up before into the C suite. Before, with knowledge management, a lot of times, and I kind of saw this on the client side when I was buying systems or building them. And have certainly seen it on the side of being, the CMO, which is nobody really wants to bill at the company to do that, right? It's like when you go out with those friends who, when the check comes, they get alligator arms. They don't want to pay, right? And that's kind of what happens with the KM check. It's
Yeah.
one of the most important things for an organization to think about and think through. But ultimately, at the senior leadership, it historically has been challenged to get, a singular group or a singular person to stand up and say, I'm willing to do this. It's hard, depending on how you do it, it can be resource intensive. What I think has changed, Bob, is I think AI has changed that. And it's some for the good, some for the maybe not as good. Now everything is getting run through the C suite, although it's usually the CIO or the CTO. And the critical to quality items that they have may be different than what's really going to drive an organization forward when it comes to knowledge capture, when it comes to knowledge utilization, knowledge flow. A lot of times CIOs and CTOs, again, they're incented to do this, are about, how do you take tech stack out, or how do you simplify this? In reality, the veracity of your knowledge and the breadth of your knowledge is going to be a benefit, assuming, right? Assuming that it doesn't have rot, it's not redundant, outdated, trivial, assuming it's accurate. That's going to be a benefit to AI in the long run to have those diverse sources. And that's what we're, I think, navigating through. And the report you're mentioning, our value of enterprise intelligence report, was because we didn't see a lot of people talking in the market about how do you tie the value of knowledge as an asset, right? Like, think about the assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. Can we take that application, think about it for knowledge, and then try to provide a way for companies to value that knowledge in a way that looks more like something a CFO would like versus a knowledge manager or somebody in that space. And that's what we've attempted to do there.
Yeah. When I think about the categories that you laid out in the report, there was, you can correct me if I go off course, but part of it is you've got some intellectual property that you need to make sure is available for monetization, and or maybe it's, are people infringing on that intellectual property. So there's that piece of it. And then there's the implicit and sort of institutional, tacit knowledge that your employees have, which I think is the most of the most interest to me, just because I have done a lot of work in the past around like collective intelligence and what is these days, what does that mean in the age of AI? What who makes up that collective that has now been, captured and codified and used as training sets into some of these AI tools that we're using now. And then there's this third category of explicit knowledge, I think you described it as, which and how would you categorize that? I mean, is that like market research reports and stuff like that, or is that IP?
It's kind of all the things that show up when people are thinking about, "Oh, I need to categorize and find this," right? So, it
Right.
could be those, it could be, technical excellence, right? In terms of, things you're developing. It could be, the generation of company policy and those types of things, right? It's all
Okay.
explicitly this is, it's kind of out there versus obviously tacit knowledge lives below the
Yeah.
surface. You may know
Yeah.
it's living under the water or not. And, I think you know, we've certainly seen, and I've lived this, when you have high attrition, when you had the great resignation, that was going on, a lot of companies were, I think, shocked at how much of that tacit knowledge walked out of the door. It's very easy to kind of put in, if for some reason the company goes, "Hey, Dan, you're done at, 1 o'clock this afternoon," they can put a stop on my computer and not, have anything go out the door. But the tacit knowledge that's going out the door would be pretty consequential, and I think companies underestimated that. But yeah, the report, appreciate that summary. I mean, that's a great way of looking at kind of the things we're talking about.
This comes to mind a lot. This undervalued sort of tacit knowledge. I mean, I feel like that's always been true, but now I guess I think about it as a concern in the sense that companies are making these sort of knee jerk reactions, whether it's the economy or it actually is jobs have been automated away or replaced by AI, task by task. You get to a point where it's just like, okay, this is we're going in this direction, and we are in a way sort of devaluing the human side of what makes us who we are, right? And so whether that's a brand perception thing or it's a cultural thing, internally, I just I continue to think that organizations are making these cuts and not incorporating the value of that into the equation. They can't. It just seems impossible that they are based on the significance of some of the cuts that they're making. It just seems very myopic to me.
Well, right, not only the cuts, but I think the forward-looking statements of what's going to happen, right? Like that's maybe that's not helpful, either, but it's hey, we may not be cutting today, but when we think about the need for future employment or future kind of hiring, it's going to look like, X minus whatever percent, and it's
Yeah,
significant to percent to your point.
yeah,
It's interesting, and I don't, it just kind of jumped in my head a little bit, but when I joined Bloomfire, OpenAI had been out, a few months at that point, and so it was obviously sucking up a lot of the oxygen. It's moved, exponentially faster. All these have. The one thing I don't hear as much in the parlance as much anymore as hallucinations, right? You're not hearing it in that general consumption, but I think the reality is they're still happening, and the large language models and the interfaces for them, and some of the prompt engineering or RAG or whatever elements you want to pick on. It's gotten really good in 2.5, 3 years, and so I think there's a little bit of a false sense of security that what I put in is right coming out. And to your point, Bob, you still need people who are capable to find those points out, right? I think, what I don't wanna see is taking, that output for what, without thought or without review and being, either passed along or passed off as work or whatever the case may be. I do think there will be a little bit of everything seems to go ditch to ditch nowadays, but it feels like there is a ditch coming around that where there's going to be some decisions made off of what ostensibly are hallucinations or a lack of institutional control maybe by a company, and it'll end up having an impact. the way, for it to really get paid attention to, it needs to have a dollar impact, right? Like it has to actually deter your ability to grow, innovate, or cause significant risk. And we've looked, and again in the report, like we've looked at that and tried to capture some of those metrics that go unmeasured, right? So when you think about knowledge and you think about that value of knowledge, it's easy when you have a knowledge management system to go, oh, we're saving this many hours, or we're, more efficient in this way. What we tried to do, and a lot of that is based on revenue per employee as a metric, right, is to say,
I don't know about you, but I don't know very many people that are hopeful about the world of work. And I'd like to change that. My name is Marcus Mossberger, and I started the Hope at Work podcast, where you'll find two things. Number one, really interesting guests, and number two, innovative ideas about the future of work. Check it out.
hey, are you with access to knowledge, are you more likely to be able to achieve your OKRs? Are you more likely to be able to onboard someone to full capability faster? Are you able to, get at innovation and collaboration in different ways, and then try to put value to that based on, the number of hours you would spend, but tie it back to revenue per employee? That we feel like that's going to break through with CFOs a little bit more than just it's 20 hours here, it's 15 hours
Yeah.
there.
No, I like the way you're framing that, and just give some of these decision makers some concrete examples and say, okay, we're telling you this isn't like a opinion, this isn't a matter of expertise. We've run the numbers, we've done the analysis, we've checked it twice, and this is what we conclude. And so before you consider a reduction in force, or before you go through the decision making process of how much of this group to cut, or which people to cut, is it based on performance? It could be other factors at play. It just seems like how could this not be one element of the formula? Just like we think about, I was on a call this morning talking about strategic workforce planning and whether or not your AI and automation strategy is part of strategic workforce planning. And to me, that shouldn't even be a debate. Like, how could it not be? I'm starting to think about it as strategic work planning, not strategic workforce planning, because there's lots of elements, both through human and digital labor, in a way, where where you need to understand how all the pieces fit together, or how they will fit together, in 6 months or a year or whatever. You need to understand the trajectory of skills development, of skills atrophy. You need to understand where the demand is going to be, and how I'm going to, backfill those gaps if they exist. And so, I mean, these are not easy problems to solve. I certainly don't want to give that impression by any stretch, but I just think, an organization is itself an ecosystem, and you need to understand, how their how the interconnectedness affects people and
Yeah,
outcomes.
I mean, I'm glad, you're not expecting you and I to solve it by the end of our call. Like
Right.
that'd be quite the thing. Yeah, I love the words you use, the skills atrophy, right? I think that's a real concern, and I think it's exacerbated by, the fact that we're kind of coming out of this remote work, hybrid work type of thing, right? Because I think it's been unfair to folks who've started their career in the last, say, 6 years. Right, and I'm not saying, look, I'm not dying on any hills when it comes to in-person versus remote, like, I think every company's gotta figure that out, but for people earlier in their career, and I'm, lucky enough to have some very smart folks we've hired on who were, in the very beginning, or nearer to the beginning than the end of their careers. The time when we're able to get together and spend it kind of working together is always time well spent.
Yep.
And we're remote first as a company, it works for us. But I do think it does take something away from folks who are earlier in their career. I mean, I spent, a lot of time, doing very rote things when it came to analysis and synthesis, right? I can, like, I mean, the GPTs of the world, the different tools of the world do a decent job of starting that in a way where you're not starting from a blank page anymore. There was benefit when I used to have to start at a blank page for me to get better at it, for me to force myself to go, I got to figure this out, right? And so I think the skills will evolve, but there's certainly, going to be an atrophy of those types of synthesis and analysis skills, especially for folks I think who never had to kind of do it on their own. And I think they'll get great at it, right? Like I'm not worried long term, but in the short term, there's going to be a little bit of unevenness, I think, in how people figure that out and how it gets applied. I was thinking about I was talking with our CEO, Philip Britton, who joined us in January. He's got, some stops at Google in his background. He was, CTO at Thomson Reuters. And we were talking about Conway's Law, right? Which is kind of this idea of like the systems of a company tend to mimic the way that the company communicates things. And I think there's a little bit of truth to what you're saying there. It's like, when you talk about kind of, how does this get put into place? How do you start to build for the future? Like the way that a company is communicating to its people is going to end up being the way that company is organized, right? And so if it's talking about we're going to go heavy into AI, if it's talking about like we're going to treat agents as kind of an extension of the workforce, that's going to mean one thing versus a company that views AI more as a tool in the hands of its employees versus companies that might be a little bit more, I'm not going to say behind the curve, but maybe are more pensive about how deeply they're going to really integrate it into the system. So
yeah, I think you just had me thinking about like, this switches gears a little bit, but like that mentality and how you sort of, maintain and evolve that the cultural aspects really goes back to some of the human centricity elements that I talk about a lot on this show and anyone else who will listen. But really like let's think about the overall, value of, the human contributors to everything that we do, right? I mean, your talent, your strategy doesn't execute itself, right? So your talent strategy is paramount when you talk about whatever business strategy and technology strategy that you're developing in that roadmap. And so you've really got to understand what makes up that value, and some of that is the tacit knowledge that people have. It's the relationships that they've built with within the company and beyond. And so I just think we need to think about and maybe even expand how many people define human centricity. Like what does that mean? Yes, of course, it's about let's make more fair, decisions, especially throughout the talent life cycle. Let's make sure we've got the cognitive diversity to make the right, sort of well-formed or informed decisions. And so obviously that inherent knowledge inside the company is vital to doing that. But I think there's just a lot of facets to what we mean by paying attention to the humans and making sure that we use technology and all of that, sort of collective intelligence and enterprise intelligence to, make sure that people are achieving their potential for themselves, for their team, and for the organization. I mean, isn't that you would do? I mean, you guys called out in the report all these other areas that are of significant, value to the enterprise. And so, yeah, it seems illogical to say that this is not a tangible, critical asset that makes us who we are.
Yeah, I mean, I love the call out on cognitive diversity because I think if you take things at the surface, like that's one of those things that's probably flashing yellow light on the board right now, right? Where it's like, if everybody's using the same chatbot at a company, right, that's run by the same LLM, how differentiated is my prompt going to be that produces a result, right? Versus if you're asking 10 different people with different backgrounds, different experiences, how to solve a problem, you're going to get 10 very different answers. And that cognitive diversity is beneficial to keeping a fresh perspective, and I think to really moving forward as an organization. One of the things I saw in person at Bloomfire when I was on the client side, right? When I became a buyer of the platform, because I was in the Berkshire Hathaway chemical company, was a couple things. This was a new tool, right? This was something different. This was reaching across silos in an organization that really wasn't great at reaching across silos. And, first off, you had just all this tacit knowledge buried in the company. And the first thing was like, oh my God, do I have permission to share this? Right? Like, am I going to get in trouble if I post this or I put this out there for everybody to see? That was one piece. And then the second was, I'm going to be judged on this, right? Like this is going outside my network of people here, my small group that sees my PowerPoint or sees my report that I write or sees the way I collect X or Y when it comes to maybe customer insight. Like, what if I'm bad at this? Like, what if I'm actually suck at my job and everybody's going to, kind of call out the emperor with no clothes? And so, like, we had to really overcome that to unlock those pockets of knowledge to the organization to become part of the collective, right? And that's with a digital tool, that's just part of a lot of cultures. But once you did that, one of the things we saw that was real, again, it's tough to quantify, we tried to do a little bit in the report, is, oh my goodness, like the level of questions we were getting from people on different strategic topics. I mean, it was like going from high school algebra to, like mid-college calculus over a very short amount of time, because people were naturally curious. They could self-serve. Sure, there's always going to be people out there with confirmation bias looking to, confirm the thing they want to do as opposed to challenge it. But the level and quality of questions we started to get from the organization at that first touch point, right? Just the whole playing field was rotated. And I do think when done well and done right, knowledge management tools, partnered with AI and that can move the yardstick, if you would, for the whole organization. Oftentimes we say, ultimately one of our goals is to, elevate the performance of the average employee to that of the exceptional employee today. And I think I don't think that, hopefully that doesn't feel too Pollyanna-ish in a AI-driven world, but we do like to keep that as a bit of a North Star for us. This isn't about replacement as much as it is about just elevation of skill.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was coming to mind when you're talking about that and relating it to your earlier point about like the veracity of data and information, it's like if you capture the tacit knowledge of your supposed experts, like how that gets sort of validated or how you sort of agree that this is because if it's not that explicit knowledge, right, coming down, maybe top down that says this is our policy or this is how this works or whatever, and it is just who's got sort of subject matter, expertise, has that been codified, and was that the right person or was this the right sort of collective, was this the right crowd to say, I'm going to take the aggregate sort of wisdom of this crowd, they seem to agree or whatever, and that's going to get, codified and made available to say, this is how we, this really is the sort of trusted, encapsulation of our most, knowledgeable people. Because, back in the day, so in the 20 aughts, is that what they call it? A long time ago, before we really were even talking publicly around, predictive AI, let alone generative AI, there were these expert, knowledge systems that I know you're familiar with, really complex, like tree structures about how you tap into these different, knowledge for customer service or all kinds of things. But the way that expertise discovery was working at IBM at the time was largely powered by a bunch of IBM research projects that were doing social network analysis in early days of graph databases. And you could basically say, look, I want to learn about this subject. And it would literally tap into the directory as well as the collaboration, platform, and it would try to basically assimilate all that information to say, here are these things, and then it would rely on crowdsourcing once again, not just to gather the expertise, but to actually validate, like, this is a good answer, right? It was sort of, like Quora.com, Qra, I think that's still around. But like, you can't just be the know-it-all and say, here's your answer. It's like, no, what do other people think? Is this the right answer? Is this a good answer? So you relied on the crowd to basically elevate almost like a version of stack rank.
Yeah, crowdsourcing is what they've called a lot of times, right?
Yeah. So these days, I guess I think about it in the context of AI and AI assistants, and everyone can have. I mean, I have my own digital. I don't like to call it a digital twin, but I have my own. I refer to it as a digital advisor, but it's basically a digital version of a lot of my knowledge and thoughts and things like that. And I've got a summer intern that I gave access to him. It's not you have to have the URL to know how to get to it. So I'm not imagining there's a lot of people looking for it, but technically, yeah, it's in the GPT catalog. But yeah, I gave him access. I said, listen, you're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. If you ever have questions or just want to learn about something that I happen to know, here's access to Digital Bob, and just have at it, and let me know if you run into any. Let me know what it doesn't know, or let me know what you think or whatever. And so inside an organization, I just wonder, how do companies even think about that in terms of, is this the right approach to disseminate knowledge and access to the tacit knowledge and institutional knowledge that we have, breaking down time barriers and remote participation or whatever your work arrangement is. But I also think about it in terms of, our organization's going to get comfortable with that enough to say, well, I've already got 80% of Bob digitized, so maybe I should think twice about whether I need Bob, right? So I mean, these are not that far-fetched concerns. I mean, this honestly could be happening right now, mid 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair thing to bring up, and I would be lying if I say I know how fast those things are going to go, right? Ultimately, I think part of the reason you keep human Bob around and not just rely on digital Bob is that we've seen how much change has happened in the last couple of years in any topic, right? And so when you're bringing on folks who have some expertise or have some ability to demonstrate a capacity to have impact, right? Then it's not you aren't necessarily saying, well, I've captured all of Bob. It's it's really what's Bob going to do next based on that. And maybe you could say, all right, well, I can predict that with AI. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think about this. When I had a newer CEO that was coming on board very quickly at that company, and he had installed like an 85-inch screen in his office, just something obscene, right? And it was touchscreen. And I remember, I think, being summoned into that office, and he had our knowledge system up, right? And he had about 10 different windows and tabs open, and he was kind of in that human way going, and this was, years ago now, but this was, hey, this is really interesting. I'm learning about this. I'm learning about this. I'm learning about this. They're all linking back to the same author. I want to talk to her, right? And so, agentic behavior wise, I think that element of AI is coming to bear very quickly for knowledge systems, ourselves included. But the reality is that I don't know what your next question is. I can probably do a pretty good job of, one, getting you an answer that's accurate, right? Like, I can get you an answer. I can probably start to do some synthesis, but it's really about, what does that person or Bob know, in the seams of this, right? In the things that aren't necessarily easily captured. in written word or in that you end up paying for, and that's going to evolve. Like you said, it's going to evolve, I think, over the next few years as the technology continues to rapidly change. But there is value to that, and having that person to be able to put additional context, I think, and then apply it to the business in a way that might be a little bit more nuanced than the models are doing today.
I had a thought come into my head about these digital assistants, not digital assistants, like note takers and stuff, and that people are using for just, I see a lot in the interview space, but even just general, meetings. I mean, I use Read.ai to take notes and give me summaries and stuff like that. But I was just thinking about.
Hello, this is Michael Vandervoort from the Drive Through HR podcast, where we discuss ideas, trends, and activities that impact HR, talent, HR technology, and the workplace. Our focus is on expanding knowledge and igniting curiosity as we hear directly from people who are shaping the future of the HR industry. Join us.
The adoption or pushback of having those in regular routine meetings, there's a lot of value in that, so that you've got all the notes captured at once. Hopefully the summarization capabilities have been thoroughly evaluated, so you're not missing anything. But I was just thinking about how some of that information is sort of codified and captured and made available to others, and how that might work, because I do feel like the adoption of those tools is gonna go up significantly over the next 18 months or whatever, to the point where it's sort of ubiquitous. Like, you should just go into a meeting expecting that not everyone in that meeting is a human being to a degree. But even now, like, you see, there's a debate, right? Like, some people think, look, I expect you to show up for your meeting, not your digital assistant, and understand what the takeaways are or whatever. So I guess I was curious about maybe stories that you've heard or familiar with, where people are trying to understand that kind of sort of knowledge that might otherwise go off into the ether, and how to sort of capture that in an ethical and safe way, in terms of privacy and things like that. I mean, you don't want everything that you utter in a meeting to become part of necessarily your corporate enterprise knowledge base. But certainly, I think about all the great ideas and knowledge and perhaps context that happens in conference rooms in every company on the planet, that just never makes it out of that room.
Yep, it's a good point. I mean, we use those tools here as well. I think there's probably an expectation, if you're in a commercial role and working, with customers today, whether you're, selling to them or marketing or doing, customer support work with them, they're probably going to be recorded, right? Your company's doing it, potentially the other company's doing it, right? And so, you know, and we certainly do it. Every sales call we have is logged, and I can see a summary of it, and I can use AI to start to get a sense of it. Now, whether that should become part of the long-term enterprise solution, as an enterprise data solution, it's another different question, right? Maybe there are going to be those who are kind of pedantic about it and saying, yeah, it all is part of it, right? It's commercial contact, and like that way, if Jane is working with customer X, and Jack has a different contact there, and there's context in Jane's call about the company, Jack has the benefit of that context as well, right? So it's feeding the customer insight, if you would, or it's feeding some of those in the margins. Ethically, I mean, obviously most of them show up like their own member, and they say, like Dan's note taker, Bob's note taker, right? So there's at least, ability to go, hey, like they're in here. The robots are listening. But yeah, I think I would 100% think that will become the norm, and the exception will be for any commercial or customer facing calls. There'll be an exception not to have that. Internal calls, different different thing, right? If it's you and I talking about, a team that we manage or employees, maybe that's not, should never become part of it.
Yeah.
But if it's me pitching out a 20-page report on something, right, where we spent money to get insights or we spent, time to really bring forth a synthesis of information, and we're getting the stakeholders' opinions when we're getting the ideas, together to do next steps, maybe that does become part of the record, right? Because that's that tacit knowledge, and you now have, again, a perspective on it coming from the people who you value enough to pay them to continue to be there, right? That you're bringing me in because I'm not, I'm going to have a perspective. How do I capture that? How do I make sure that stays as part of it?
I also think this ties to, the company culture and your, in a way, it is a part of your AI strategy, right? It's not just, go to market and how we're, marketing ourselves and how we're managing customer relationships or customer support and things like that. It's like, listen, we want people to openly share their expertise as well as their opinions. This hopefully is happening on some level just through social analytics, where you're not relying on like a point in time, annual, survey and stuff like that. That those things are complemented by unstructured, sort of ongoing listening, which already has, quite a few, guardrails on it in terms of anonymizing the data and looking at things in aggregate and stuff like that. And so I think there's some key principles and learnings from some of those exercises that we've done for many years now. But I also think, there's a foundation of trust that needs to be established, and trust is bidirectional, right? You need to treat employees and other people who are doing work for you treat them as adults and trust them. But, it's reciprocal, right? The organization needs to earn trust and say, these are the safeguards that we're putting, in place, and that's going to drive, meaningful, adoption if you can establish, that trusted relationship. So I think there's a lot to think about there, and just in terms of how you communicate out to the organization and the type of culture and behavior that you're expecting, which leadership needs to, be
right.
Represent themselves well in that area as well. So walk the talk, and let's all be responsible, and let's all be trustworthy, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a couple things I think are really important, and I want to make sure like people didn't miss them, because one is the trust piece, but it's my general sense that, having worked where I've worked over the years, that people don't trust companies as much as they trust other people. And so, like, the trust in a company is indicative of the leaders, right? The trust they have in the leader or the person who's their direct boss in many cases, right? More than it is some kind of monolithic organization, right? And so, as a leader myself, like, what I have to do, like, is earn that trust daily, no matter what element of a process or a culture element that it is. I have to, it's not just about AI, it's about everything. If somebody doesn't trust me in terms of, thinking I have, I'm not going to say always their best interest, but their interest in mind, then they're not going to trust me with anything else that gets said. That's one thing. The other is, like, I always used to joke about this, right? It's like people tend to do the things that will bring value to them, and that's not because people are selfish, right? It's just the reality is that is the way it works. That if it I used to joke, is like, look, like, my job may entail these things, but if my boss for some reason, this is when I was working in offices more, said, part of Dan's bonus is going to be based on whether I have a dozen donuts on my desk every morning, that may not be part of my job, but my guess is that person's getting their donuts, right? And so, people just tend to say, all right, how do I want to understand a policy, or I want to understand this, like, how does this affect my ability to get the things I need out of the organization. For some folks, it's upward mobility. For some folks, it's flexibility. For many, it's, income and increasing that. But, ultimately they kind of vote with that. And I think that's one of the reasons, again, I'm not, I'm not dying on this hill, but like, that's one of the reasons I think there has been so much pushback to moving from remote to hybrid to in office, is because like ultimately they see the company still making a lot of money.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think they see themselves being able to achieve what they need to achieve based on their roles, which is true. And so really it's like, well, I'm giving up so much for no real benefit to the company. Like that does not compute to me. And that's why I think you see a lot of this pushback is like I'm willing to come along for the ride, but like it doesn't make sense because it's not any more beneficial to me. And ultimately, like it's not been, I don't see it as beneficial to the company. And so that's why you're starting to see kind of mandates and hard lines put in, because that's, tends to be where corporate clients want people in the office.
Yeah. I think that's a whole nother.
Yeah, it's another ball of wax, but I think
Yeah. Yeah.
there's some allegories there between the two.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I totally appreciate your point earlier about, young talent really needs the mentorship and the observability of, working with, some of the experts within an
Well,
organization.
but to your point, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like,
Yeah.
how do you think trust is born, right? Like
Yeah.
like the fact that you can kind of spend that time together, and again, it's not that everybody's going to be friends at work, but it is earned over, those social interactions, the human interactions you have. Like that,
Yeah.
it's tough to do that when every interaction you have is through Zoom or through, you know, Microsoft Teams or whatever the case may
Yep.
be.
How do you think about, like, as people learn how to use AI in their daily job, and an organization may say, well, how do we capture what you guys are learning? We're all trying to learn, AI, and we're learning at different speeds, and maybe we're using different, tools and things like that. How do you think about how to sort of capture that? I've been out of companies for a couple of years now, so you know, I was done with large enterprise before ChatGPT came out, so I'm not actually sure how this works. But like, if everyone's playing with different things, and hopefully they're doing some peer-to-peer, learnings, and lunch and learns and stuff like that, where people are getting each other up to speed. But once you know all that, I mean, is that just a modern sort of subset of enterprise knowledge management, or are these kind of sort of separate and distinct?
So, I think a couple things. One, I look at, and again, I recognize, what it is, but you look at something like ChatGPT, and that really entered the space as a consumer tool, right? So it was, and not saying it was driven, to just consumers using it, but it was not an enterprise grade tool, it was a consumer tool. So you started to establish, that expectation of what all AI tools should be now. And I think to some extent, you know, they still own a lot of that consumer mindset in terms of like this is what it should be like. So there was this experimentation process for maybe the first year or so. And I think that got very dangerous very quickly for companies. Maybe not your mid-size and lower companies, but your big enterprises were like, whoa, 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 whoa. So you're taking our data that we're paying for, you're taking our knowledge and you're plugging it into this consumer tool, and you're playing with it or using it, and Claude or the others could be, Anthropic, all those could be the same things. And so what you saw was the CIO or the CTO start to put real constraint around that very quickly. The bigger the company, the more constrained, right? It's like, you're not going to
Yeah.
use that. We're blocking this. And so now there's this process and period where it's like, we have to figure out what, enterprise grade looks like for us as a company. And so you've got, more resource flowing to IT. They like to build things themselves a lot of times, right?
Sure.
As you well know, and then so it's moved from a bit of a department decision to an enterprise decision in many cases. And then every SaaS tool in the last 2 years has said, we're going to slap AI on this, or we're going to do AI with this, right? Like,
Right.
or we're native AI, and that's fine too. But so I think the exploration is still happening probably for, very tech forward companies or very, smaller companies. I think there are POCs, if you would, in place in a lot of companies we see, but, ultimately, what's going to end up, I think, being most successful is if you can demonstrate, how, one, that you're secure and safe, right? Like, I mean, you're not, you're doing what you're saying you're doing in AI. You're not putting, undue risk on an organization. There's a bigger company we were working with, and they've been partners with us for a long time. And just to turn on the AI piece, which was, part of their package to begin with. So it wasn't even a cost adder. It was like, okay, here's your 14 steps to do that. And like, it's not like these were all that straightforward, right? This was, it wasn't quite, what is it, Frodo taking the ring back, but it's pretty close. So
Right.
it can be pretty punitive, but the experimentation is still happening. I mean, we use tools that are, we use our own tool, obviously, day in, day out for our knowledge, but we're also using other tools to help us with marketing, other tools, to your point, on the, capturing some of the calls and so there is experimentation happening in a closed loop to say, does this add value? If it does, it's something we can invest in. And if it doesn't, that puts the whole platform of the software at risk if the AI doesn't work or it doesn't work well.
Yeah, I think organizations are going to have to build up their innovation appetite and do some experimentation and see, we can get a chance to dig into the innovation side of things. But I do think, people and organizations need to be able to use AI to both, protect themselves, mitigate risk, but also to go on offense and see how can this fuel, growth and things like that. So, Dan, it's been awesome to talk to you. I want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I will definitely put links to your LinkedIn profile, to Bloomfire, and to the report in the show notes.
I'll make sure you have a link to our. It's featured in HBR too. We put a feature in there, so that's kind of the entry level version to get the summary, and then if you want to go deep, you can get the report.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you again, Dan, for joining me. This has been great, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.